Welcome to another explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating, highly complex medical framework, the surgical management of pituitary disorders. We're going on an intense journey right into the high-stakes world of neuroendocrinology, and honestly, I am so excited to discover exactly how this incredibly delicate process works.
Okay, let's just dive right into this. How exactly do you operate on the body's master gland when it's literally buried deep inside the skull? Think about it, it's a massive physical and clinical challenge. You have this tiny structure that dictates huge physiological changes in the body, but it's tucked away in one of the most inaccessible places imaginable, completely surrounded by vital nerves and blood vessels.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the pituitary challenge. Then we'll look at when surgery is needed. Third, inside the operation. Fourth, managing post-op risks. Fifth, aeromedical and long-term recovery. And finally, upholding standard of care.
Section 1. The Pituitary Challenge, the master gland at risk.
We call the pituitary the master gland for a very good reason. It runs the show. It controls growth hormone, ACTH for your adrenal glands, TSH for your thyroid, LH and FSH for reproduction, and prolactin. Now, when things go wrong, the pathology, it usually falls into two buckets. You either get hypopituitarism, which is a hormone deficiency, or hypersecretion, where the gland just pumps out way too much of one or more hormones. What's truly staggering here is that pituitary adenomas are the most common cause of Sellar masses. Those are tumors in the small pocket of bone holding the gland. They actually account for up to 10% of all intracranial neoplasms, or brain tumors. So what are the classic red flags? You really need to look out for a combination of headaches, visual field defects, and endocrine symptoms like menstrual or sexual dysfunction.
All of this can lead to a severe physical crisis known as the mass effect. Picture this. There's only about a 1 centimeter gap between the pituitary gland and the optic chiasm, which is where your optic nerves cross. So when a macroadenoma, which is a tumor 10 millimeters or larger, starts to grow, it rapidly runs out of room. The tumor literally compresses that optic chiasm, and that leads to a very specific type of visual loss called bilateral temporal hemianopia. Basically, the patient loses their outer peripheral vision. It's a very harsh physical reality of exactly where this gland is located.
Section 2. When surgery is needed, choosing intervention. And this brilliantly illustrates the decision matrix doctors use. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Take prolactinomas, for example. They are the most common type of pituitary adenoma. But their first-line treatment isn't actually surgery, it's pharmacotherapy. They use dopamine agonists, like cabergoline or bromocriptine, and these drugs are just incredibly effective at shrinking the tumor and normalizing prolactin levels. However, for almost every other type, growth hormone secreting, ACTH secreting, or non-functioning tumors that are causing those mass effects we just talked about, endoscopic surgery is absolutely the definitive first-line treatment to relieve the pressure on those vital structures.
Section 3. Inside the operation. Surgical navigation. So, how do they actually get in there? Well, the transsphenoidal approach is a true marvel of modern medicine. It's a minimally invasive surgical technique used to access the pituitary gland by going entirely through the nose and the sphenoid sinus. Unless there's significant suprasellar extension, meaning the tumor has grown way far up into the brain cavity, this endoscopic route is the primary method surgeons use today. Think about it. No major incisions on the skull, just direct, highly precise access right through the nasal cavity.
But the surgery itself is really just one part of a very critical timeline. Here are the exact chronological steps of the perioperative procedure. Step 1 is pre-op preparation. They absolutely must administer 100 milligrams of intravenous or intramuscular hydrocortisone. Why? To prevent acute adrenal insufficiency during the intense physical stress of the operation. Step 2 is the endoscopic removal itself, carefully navigating that sphenoid sinus to resect the adenoma while leaving the healthy part of the gland perfectly intact. And step 3 is totally crucial, post-op dynamic testing for adrenal and pituitary function. This has to happen at least 6 weeks after the operation so they can accurately figure out the patient's long-term hormone replacement needs.
Section 4. Managing post-op risks. High-stakes recovery.
Now, I want to lower the tone here for a second, because this is where things get really high stakes. The immediate postoperative period is fraught with severe, potentially life-threatening risks. First, there's the risk of primary and reactive hemorrhage. Managing this requires rigorous fluid resuscitation, because if a patient's blood pressure plummets and they become hypovolemic, meaning a dangerously low blood volume, clinicians have to rapidly replace those fluids, and they might even have to rush the patient right back into surgery. Then you have cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF leaks. If the tiny barrier between the brain and the nasal cavity is breached, CSF literally leaks out. This causes intracranial hypotension, which presents as severe headaches that, interestingly, get noticeably worse when the patient tries to stand up. Finally, since the posterior pituitary handles water balance, patients frequently suffer from major fluid imbalances. Things like transient diabetes insipidus, or SIADH, which causes the body to retain way too much water. Meticulous monitoring of their sodium levels and fluid output is absolutely mandatory.
And then, there's this terrifying extreme, pituitary apoplexy. This is a rapid pituitary enlargement caused by a bleed directly into the tumor. It causes immediate, severe mass effects and can literally lead to cardiovascular collapse due to acute hypopituitarism. It can even be fatal. It usually presents with a sudden, agonizing headache and visual field defects which can easily mimic a subarachnoid hemorrhage. It demands absolute urgency, folks. We're talking immediate hydrocortisone, hyper-precise fluid balance, and potentially emergency life-saving surgery. It perfectly demonstrates why rigorous postoperative monitoring isn't just a suggestion, it's a matter of life and death.
Section 5. Aeromedical and long-term recovery. Career impacts.
Now, what's really interesting about this breakdown is how the specific frequency of these tumor types directly dictates something like a military pilot's chance of ever returning to the cockpit. As you can see, prolactinomas make up roughly 35% of these tumors, followed by non-functioning adenomas at 30%, growth hormone at 20%, and ACTH around 7%. The type of tumor a pilot develops entirely dictates the treatment they get, and that treatment dictates their flight status.
Let's look at the U.S. Air Force waiver guidelines, because the aeromedical concerns here are severe. Remember that 35% who have prolactinomas? While their standard medical treatment is dopamine agonists, but those drugs cause nausea, dizziness, mental fogginess, and postural hypotension. You don't have to be a doctor to know those side effects are completely incompatible with flying a fighter jet. Now, for the folks who undergo surgery, any visual field defects require strict Humphrey 30-2 testing. Even a tiny, minor loss of peripheral vision is catastrophic in a cockpit. And for patients with ACTH-secreting tumors causing Cushing's disease, the persistent need for long-term steroid replacement disqualifies aviators entirely. Even for those who fully recover, strict waiver requirements mandate annual MRI or CT scans just to monitor for recurrence. So as you can see, the medical treatment can ground a flying career just as quickly and permanently as the tumor itself.
But hey, I do want to provide a moment of optimism here. 73 to 96%, that is the post-operative remission rate for pituitary adenomas. It's fantastic. And for those who suffer visual deficits before the surgery, their visual recovery rate is an incredible 88 to 92%. So, with the right, precise intervention, the long-term prognosis is highly favorable.
Section 6. Upholding standard of care, legal and ethical rules.
So the crucial point we need to understand here is a very specific distinction in medical law. Medical malpractice is defined as intentional behavior outside the bounds of what is considered acceptable by a professional governing body. It implies a deliberate intent to operate outside safe, standard practices. Medical negligence, on the other hand, is an unintentional act of omission or commission by an otherwise prudent physician that unfortunately results in harm. They might sound similar in conversation, but in the eyes of the law, the presence of intent makes a massive, massive difference.
Tying those legal definitions right back to everything we just discussed about the extreme risks of pituitary surgery, the precise timing of the 100 milligrams of hydrocortisone, the incredibly delicate surgical navigation, the hypervigilant monitoring for CSF leaks and apoplexy, this is exactly why meticulous adherence to protocols is totally non-negotiable. Physicians are legally and ethically obligated to discharge their duties with the utmost professional manner. In an area as profoundly delicate as the master gland of the brain, any deviation from established medical science can result in catastrophic outcomes. And that opens the door to devastating consequences for both the patient and the practitioner.
So, we've covered the intense physiology, the marvels of surgical technique, the perilous, high-stakes recovery, and the incredibly strict aeromedical and legal standards. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over from this explainer. How do we continue to balance aggressive, necessary surgical intervention with preserving a patient's holistic quality of life and even their career? It's the ultimate tightrope that neuroendocrinologists walk every single day, And honestly, it's a profound reminder of just how fragile, yet resilient, the human brain truly is. Thanks so much for joining me today.